Welcome to a new episode of the Unicorn Bakery. My name is Fabian, and today's guest is Kison Patel, the founder of DealRoom and M&A Science. DealRoom was first, it's a software for lifecycle management of mergers and acquisition, and then later on he built M&A Science on top, which is a portfolio of software companies or softwares to manage mergers and acquisitions. We will dive deeper in a second. There are more than 40 people working for the company. It's bootstrapped, which is very interesting because from the outside, I know, I really think it's very interesting how you build a, let's say, machine for understanding problems and then figuring out, okay, what solution to build, what not, and having the audience to build them for, which is an interesting system that I would love to cover in a second. But before we dive deeper, thanks to Thomas Rack for the introduction. And Kison, it's a pleasure. I'm happy to have you on the show.
Hey, Fabian, thanks for having me.
Let us quickly start with a bit of background. I already said you started with a software company for DealRoom and then built a portfolio of softwares afterwards. What is it that really made you go into the M&A part and then build software for that and then also stay for it quite long? You're in the industry, at least building your own companies for even 11 years plus now.
Something about businesses that drew me to it. I don't know what it is. The numbers, the opportunity to grow a business, something I've always been interested in. When I was a kid, my family owned and operated little motel businesses. As a lot of other Indians with the last name Patel do. And that's got my first exposure to it and was always interested in it. And yeah, I ended up not doing so well in undergrad. I actually failed out of my undergrad program. Found my way working up through some retail businesses to get my chops in terms of a strong work ethic, and then ended up in residential real estate sales, where I was terrible at selling houses. People at the time didn't want to buy houses from a 21-year-old kid. And I stumbled upon an opportunity to join a startup that was a M&A advisory practice, and got my chops over there, working on deals directly from the front end of the deals, going out, sourcing opportunities where the firm was actually doing well, generating inbound leads. So I was able to work with those opportunities. After 1 year, I sold, I think, 3 little businesses. I didn't feel aligned with the overall strategy of the company. So I wanted to move about and do something on my own. I think that's just something that was wired in me. I knew I was eventually going to do something on my own. I started this M&A advisory practice, consulting initially with small transactions with private individuals, whether they're buying or selling, and then grew it to working with institutions, larger hotel chains like Hampton, Extended Stay America, La Quinta, then got into working with financial institutions, regional banks, to acquire small banks, help small banks sell to the bigger banks. And then the recession happened. That's where I wanted to get out of the advisory side of it because I got burnt out from jumping deal to deal, and also felt I hit this class ceiling, whereas a boutique practice, you don't get the opportunities on the larger $100+ million deals. You're sort of stuck dealing with these smaller $5 to $50 million deals. And I saw this tech industry that was just blooming. So I wanted to get into tech. I started with a little startup in mind to build a whole portfolio of automated blogs. I think we got a couple hundred of them going. That was playing against Google's algorithm, generating some revenue. One day Google updated their algorithm, and all these websites disappeared off of the search, which brought the revenues down to zero, and got back to ground zero to rethink things. That's where I was reflecting. I think in that experience was the first time I got to work with software engineers. And working with software engineers, I was intrigued in how they utilize this product called Jira to manage developing the software itself, where I was looking at my own experience thinking, why the hell isn't there a project management tool to manage mergers and acquisitions? And that is what inspired the idea to start a company, DealRoom, in 2012. And that led to many more hard lessons learned about building a tech startup, but that's what got us to the path that we are today.
Very interesting. I have one question that a few listeners might have in mind. After you said, okay, you're stuck with the smaller deals. Why is that? Can we quickly talk about the philosophy and the psychology of the larger deals and why it's so hard to get them and who really gets them so that people are on track how M&A works and who is doing what?
I see this in other industries too, where when you work at a larger company, they almost are bound to work with other larger companies from a risk perspective, where they look at a smaller provider as being too risky. Like they can't, if something goes wrong, they don't have this healthy balance sheet that they can go after. So they view them as a higher risk profile. I think that was one big element of it. And then just the brand. I feel like there's people in finance tend to be more conservative, so they will latch onto brands despite the quality or end results of that service or product. So I think those were the couple of factors that were working against us. We didn't have such a recognized brand, and that just being the size, we were a small company of 5, and you're competing against these larger companies with hundreds of employees, a big name, process, very mature approach in how they do deals and their track record. So that's it works when you're working with some private individual and you can sell yourself that, hey, I'm a scrappy individual entrepreneur just like yourself, and I'm here to make this happen, and we'll be committed to it and can clearly demonstrate I'm going to work harder than the folks at the big firms with their MBA degrees. But when you start working at the larger institutions, that doesn't matter as much. They're really looking at how you look on paper in terms of explaining to their boss why they chose this firm over the big name blue stamp IBM providers out there.
So let's say if I had the experience from a larger firm, then I might even be afterwards, and then I'm doing my boutique, then I might be able to close some of the larger deals, but without the experience and the stamps, I'd say it might be super hard.
Yeah, there's those things we'll talk about because I think there's, over time you learn there's ways to get around that. There's, how if you can build some really compelling differentiators that and be clear that this is going to drive far more value and really build a strong business case that it's worth taking the risk. I think there's things that you can do to circumvent that stereotype, but it took some time in learning that. At that period of time, that I just saw that as a barrier, found my level of frustration. The whole lifestyle of jumping deal to deal. You win a deal, you close it, big excitement, but then the next day you got to start all over again. The idea of a software industry where you can solve a problem for the masses and be able to build a model where you can create reoccurring revenue appealed to me. And that's where I drew. It's interesting when you're doing this advisory because you got to do diligence on so many different industries. And I had this search where I wanted to find what the perfect business was. I remember that early in my career, I would do diligence on all kinds of businesses. Even if I didn't have a specific buyer for it, I would call the bankers up and just acted like I did just to be able to uncover the information and learn about that sector industry. And I explored everything, all these different healthcare niche type of businesses. Those people that come to the hospital and pick up those red toxic bags is a pretty lucrative business. The veterinarian clinics, the funeral homes, all these different practices, the car dealerships, used, new. And one thing I concluded was everything's got its own issues. Nothing's easy out there. But I started thinking and reflecting on what I really wanted to do professionally. And I was drawn to technology because I wanted something that wasn't so regionalized, where you're servicing this localized area, that you had an opportunity to expand even potentially internationally. I like the idea of traveling for the purpose or means around business as opposed to traveling around as a tourist. And those the ideas of the growth, seeing that tech is the industry that's in a high growth motion, and that this is something that's going to only grow further as our next generations become more adapted to technology.
So let's dive a bit deeper here. You built or started building DealRoom in 2012, and then in 2016 you added M&A Science on top. as a brand. So what I would love to understand is, for the 4 years of building DealRoom until you started M&A Science, um, what were the hardest lessons you learned, and why did you decide to build a brand on top?
Yeah, there's a lot of hard lessons learned because I didn't know what I was doing. So a lot of this was trial and error to figure things out. One was getting an engineering team that's productive. I think there's a whole learning cycle of how do you get the right talent, and there's different things of the talent that can prototype versus talent that can build a scale. And there's a number of things there. I think the early stages, that's thing that we're fortunate is we stayed really lean and had that talent that could help prototype at a very fast iterative rate that allowed us to reserve our expenses and reserve our capital and be able to get to this product market fit. And then the other go-to-market was another big challenge. The early lesson learned, the biggest one, was validating the problem you're solving. We had this idea to build a project management product. We went through this whole exercise of building an outline of what we're going to create, and this feature creep kicked in. Next thing you know, we had this massive outline of, I don't remember, it was like 50 different functionality we wanted this product to do. And then it turned into this big blur. So where do you start? And the idea was like, well, we should start in the very beginning of the deal lifecycle and work our way down. And we started building a model that was more of a marketplace for people to market their opportunities. And then we wanted to get that going, then build all the management capabilities through post-close. What we were doing was sidetracking ourselves from the real meat and the real problem that we should have been solving. We essentially were taking to market this sophisticated dumpster for deals, because those are the deals that get marketed online that way are the ones that are hard to find buyers for. And we were at this point of trying to rethink or back to the drawing board of what we should do. That's when we took a turn and took more of that traditional lean startup approach of how do you iterate. And I think I came across one of the books, Running Lean, way back then. And it was, had good examples of doing customer or problem interviews, right? So customer development interviews. And they framed it as you have two types. You do a problem interview and solution interview. So early stages, the idea is that you're interviewing your cohorts of representative of your types of customers and looking to validate the problem that you're trying to solve in the most unbiased way possible, because it is hard not to convince somebody you have the greatest idea and get them to rally behind it, especially family and friends. So you want to be able to design your questions to be as unbiased as possible and even have somebody with you. So one person can focus on asking questions, another person focus on taking the notes. We did about 40 of these interviews. And we saw a pretty clear pattern. The big thing people wanted to solve was the original thing we wanted to set out to do, was managing deals. And then in that discovery, we found the specific area, this area of due diligence. Managing the M&A process on an Excel tracker was excruciatingly painful, tedious, a big waste of time. And that allowed us to really hone in on that and validate that people would actually pay to have that problem solved. I see this with entrepreneurs, that you get caught up in your idea, you don't validate the problem itself. And, sometimes you do this stuff, and we even found in turn that you start identifying other problems that are really interesting to solve. If you do it, there's a couple other benefits. One, you could potentially line up customers ahead of time, because if they're really interested in what you're doing and what you're solving for, they may be an early customer for you. But more importantly, you capture all this language directly from these prospects in how they articulate that problem, that you will essentially repurpose when you need to talk to investors or others, when you're recruiting people or looking to identify other customers. So that was a huge value that initially we overlooked, but then we learned, like, we created this feedback loop, starting to understand the problem. And then as we started shaping the solution, we would create these little mock-ups and share them and continue doing those interviews. And it's so much more cost effective to change mock-ups as opposed to a final product. So it was important to be able to make these changes and validate what we're building as we build it. And that's your predefined agile model and that development cycle. We kept doing that. We still do that today. If I look at the product, I think less than 3% are my ideas to start with. It is 97+% developed in partnership with our customers and prospective customers. And we just continue using that feedback loop. So that was one big lesson early on, is just be dumb. How can you enter this approach and put aside your assumptions, what you think is right, and get to this mindset where you think you're wrong or you know nothing, so that you can have a discipline to proactively learn from the industry experts and these cohorts of your prospective customers. And that's when you can understand how they think, how they feel, why they feel that way, what are their goals, and align yourself around it. And really, that's what gets you in a position to accelerate the growth for your business. The M&A Science was interesting because we started building this product, and the go-to-market was a whole other challenge, because I think looking back, you should validate your go-to-market when you're validating your solution. We didn't do that. You started defaulting to looking at the landscape and say, okay, this is what other people are doing for their go-to-market. We're going to do the same thing. That was a bad idea. There are much larger, mature companies doing outbound field sales. Shouldn't be trying to do that. We should be trying to disrupt that. And it took a number of years to really figure that out. And even the market, we eventually figured out, while we had a strong business case for them to use our solution, they weren't the early adopters. We were selling to the advisors, and they were very resistant to change. They were extremely conservative. They weren't incentivized to be efficient. And over time, we discovered it was actually the corporates that were our early adopters. They're very incentivized to be efficient. They wanted to spend their time on the more value-creating activities as opposed to this administrative overhead. So we shifted our go-to-market focus on the corporates. And this is where I realized, in working with a number of customers, that we couldn't pick up what we built for one customer and repurpose it as well as we thought we would be able to. What we found out was that all these companies had a different way of thinking about M&A, different approach to M&A. What that allowed me to conclude is that this industry has this larger underpinning problem, and that the industry itself is very siloed, disconnected, lacking standardization and best practices. That for decades, the industry has operated in this level of secrecy that is, pretty a part of M&A, but it's led to this operating environment where everybody just has their own proprietary process of doing M&A. There was a lack of real evidence behind the techniques or practices of M&A itself. And around that time, it was around 2016, 2017, a good friend of mine, Andy, in marketing, and he's just a friend I'd always meet up with, kind of share my woes, startup woes with, and pick his brain for some marketing ideas. He said to me one day, he's like, "Hey man, you should do a podcast." And I was like, "What the hell is a podcast?" I had no idea. His response was like, "Don't worry about it. It's going to be the next big thing. You just got to do it." And it took a little while. A few more times he encouraged me, and then I ended up putting the ideas together because we were already comfortable doing these kind of discovery interviews for feedback. But why not take that same approach, interview practitioners to identify and understand what are the techniques that actually work for them, and can we start identifying the same thing? Can we look for patterns and validate what actually works and what doesn't work? And that's what kicked off as M&A Science as a podcast back in 2017. Then you fast forward to 2023, it's turned into a whole media business for us where, 1 million+ downloads. We've been able to publish over 1,500 pages of content from extracting the transcripts of those podcasts. So we created a whole series of blog posts, about 30 ebooks. We have our third book getting published here in the next 2 weeks. We do events now. We have a whole summit series, roundtable series, and it's this community that's now emerging and growing around that brand. And we now position M&A Science as our umbrella brand, where DealRoom sits under the umbrella brand. We have an agile M&A framework. That's an open framework that we consolidate those best practices and organize it to be able to teach off of it. A whole online academy program that we can administer the certifications around the practices of M&A. We did a spin-off product of DealRoom as a self-service data room from Firm Room. And now we're building out services and talent offerings. So it's, that same idea, right? We go back to that feedback loop as we continued, and you grow your business, you have more people involved, you continually can identify these other areas or problems and then provide a solution to those. And that's what allows our business to operate as a platform where we create solutions on the same platform that makes it easier to go to market with those solutions.
One thing that I find very interesting is that you said, okay, we tested things out. We had to talk to our potential customers to figure out, okay, what features to build and what not. And for a lot of founders, I think ego is in their way, and they think, oh, we know it better, and we have to do it on our own. The customers don't know what is needed. Where's the balance between you want to be innovative and say, okay, you're bringing out the next iPhone and the people don't know what they need, versus asking the people you want to serve what their actual problems are and translating this into a new product?
I think you can play on both sides. You can look at and having that one discipline and saying, hey, let's objectively drive the feedback from the market. And then you could be the Steve Jobs of an entrepreneur and have this grand vision. And that still happens, right? I'll still come up with ideas and things that may be coming from my own experience. And I now we have a more mature company. I have to go through the steps to validate that. And that's part of the process. So I can try to either do some mock-ups or do something to try to get that validated with some actual customers. That, hey, I need people actually going to use this. I think the best was our VP of engineering, Ilga, said it to me pretty point blunt, was that he said, we want to build things that people actually use. And it took me a little bit to think about that and said, okay, you got a point there. So, with that, like, we welcome these kind of entrepreneurial ideas in the company, but knowing that you should do some legwork to ground them and make sure that they're going to be received. And I think organizations do that. They may seem like they're throwing that hot thing out there and shotgunned it and it turned into a big success, but no, there's a level of diligence to do to make sure that you have some level of certainty that there's a reason why.
That's fair. And that also adds to the next question that I would love to ask, because I think picking the right problem to solve is a huge thing. A lot of founders out there just say, okay, problem A is now my problem that I want to solve, and they don't think about, am I working on the right problem, or is it just the first thing that came to my mind? How do you pick a problem right now? The thing about M&A Science that I think is very amazing is you now have a constant feedback loop. You can see and validate all these problems. You can prioritize them, and you then build, let's say, a data room as an example, as a next software. So what problem is large enough, relevant enough to actually start working on it? Because I can imagine that there are like hundreds of ideas that you could work on, at least dozens, but they are not worth solving.
Yeah, I think it's starting to shape like almost a traditional strategy function. And in fact, now I'm starting to read books about strategy where you have a hypothesis. And even before that, it's looking at a vision, right? Now we have existing products, it's where do we want to take our company? What does that look like over the next 5 years? What areas do we want to play in? How do we see our companies from the market perspective? What is that going to look like? And for us, it's being best in class in anything that we get into, right? Our deal room product's been going up there. We kind of started from the bottom and working our way up, and we're kind of in battle for number one spot right now. Our data room product, great traction, same thing. The value proposition is top notch, and we're really positioning that to be top in that sector. And then same thing with educational offerings. So it's always looking for these spaces that we know over time we could be number one. We might not come in the market out of the gate number one, but we know that we can eventually get to that spot and really dominate it. So that's been one core thing. And then
how much time do you give yourself for becoming number one?
It depends. It depends on it's hard to nail it. I'm not going to sit there and disappoint myself. When we have our goals, I'm very conservative. I like to be ahead of those goals and sleep well. So some of those things it's not like here's a clear, we got to do it in 3 years, 5 years. You just know the opportunity is there. You know that there's nobody that's such a strong incumbent that they can't be dispositioned for us to take over. So if we see that and sense it and saying, hey, we can be extremely, like the education space, right? We did that during COVID. We started hosting these online events. People from our feedback wanted to learn the practical how-tos of doing M&A. When we looked at the offerings for training, we found most of them were very outdated. A lot of them were hosted by consulting firms that intentionally overcomplicated the learnings around M&A so they could sell services. That's where he said, hey, there's an opportunity to really disrupt this and be number one. Because nobody's doing, and we partnered with the existing practitioners. It wasn't delivered by consultants. None of our courses, some of them are, but most of them are delivered by in-house active practitioners that do these deals day in, day out. And that was a big differentiator for us. You can learn from the people at Google and these, Atlassian and other top organizations and how they do M&A. And that's where we felt that confidence that, hey, this would be enough of a differentiator and disruptor that we could take the number one spot. So that's where that vision is there of where do you want to play. And then as you shape that, you can you start building your hypothesis, right? Like that was an example of like, people want to know this practical how-to. The training was a space we started researching and learning. And that was the hypothesis is, what if we went to market with more of a self-service, on-demand training program? And we saw these other platforms emerging like Masterclass and others, the Udemy's and things. And why not build something with that model? It doesn't currently exist in this area. And then we started doing some research to validate it and talk to folks. And then I think our other last step for validation was we were pre-selling it. So we ran a campaign to sell this product that didn't exist as an early a special. And then, we sort of pre-sold it almost like a Kickstarter style. And that gave us enough validation to go out and build that product. And it's doing well. It's only second year in, and it's already profitable and it's growing. I think that's part of, in terms of where you're growing, to think about where the areas are that you want to expand into strategically.
What would you say is important when you're preparing a pre-sale? I can imagine that a lot of founders out there think, okay, I understand that I have to figure out how what people want to buy, what people actually want, and all that. But how do I start communicating it to them, and how do I prepare properly for something like a pre-sale?
Landing page, one page. I think it's always nice just to start with that one pager. Even if you start with text, if you got a designer to work with, you can find somebody pretty inexpensive just to mock. Now you can use Canva, go mock up your own little one pager. But to be able to, again, get that feedback early, can you float it around and see if people are actually interested in it? Sometimes that's your earliest indicator right there, is just to put this out, say, hey, I'm trying to solve this problem here. Can I get your feedback on it? And people aren't even interested in giving you feedback. That might be an early indicator that you're not solving something of value to people. But I would do that. I would just because you need to shape. The hardest thing is, I think, underestimated, is shaping the messaging, right? It's one thing to build a product, right? It's hard work to build a product, but getting the messaging, the whole go-to-market stuff, is even harder to do. And the earlier you can do that and start figuring it out, even before you put a foot in building the product. I think it was like the Amazon exercise they do, where they build a press release before they even build the product, which makes a lot of sense. How is it going to be received in the market? And to be able to validate that. So with those programs, I would definitely start off with the basic one pager to be able to share that and start getting some of that early feedback. At glance, in a minute, can somebody look at this one pager and give you that feedback if they're interested or not, what questions they have, because you ultimately want to start answering some of those questions sooner than later.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's just important to repeat because a lot of founders forget that these are the basics, and just also later in the life cycle of a company just forget about feedback loops and how to evaluate everything with their customers or potential customers instead of just saying, oh yeah, I know what to build.
100%.
Let's say the company grew, you're 50 people now. I can imagine that there were a lot more struggles to building a team and building an organization and growing as a company. What would you say was another hard lesson to share?
Leadership chops. That was a big one I struggled with for a while in the beginning. I think probably when I were about 5 people going to 10, and that's when I realized that there was lacking skills. I started reading books. I think that's probably when I really got serious about reading books. And I picked up these leadership books, trying to learn how can I be a better leader to get people aligned around priorities and collaborating, working well together as a team. I eventually found out it wasn't the leadership books that were the most helpful. It was actually these organizational psychology books. Mark Goldstein's book, Just Listen, taught a lot about empathy, and realizing that was one of the critical factors I was lacking. To be able to empathize and connect with your team allows you to be a better leader, allows you to understand that you could be more of like a bottoms up, really connect with your peers, align around goals, and let them have their autonomy and accountability, and trust that they can get the things done that needs to get done. I think that was some important early lessons. I think understanding over time, when you grew around 20 people, then the emphasis became more around culture. Because if you take that vision of where you want to go and reverse engineer it, you should take these specific traits and allow that to define your culture and the people, characteristics you're looking for to help you achieve those goals. So that the defining the values became important, and that continues to get emphasized as the company grows. I think the pillars of having a good work environment stand true at all sizes, which is one, having a strong communication framework so that every person has a voice that's heard, whether it's sharing the next big idea or pointing out to cracks appearing on the floor. You want to make sure you have that strong communication platform that works across the organization. To acknowledge achievements. We do our monthly calls, and it's cross-functional. Acknowledge what engineering's achieved, sales, marketing, so forth. So making sure, I think that becomes more important for money, is for people to feel part of something that's, and getting their work acknowledged. And then third is creating an environment where you work amongst friends. That gets you excited and comfortable to ask for help when you need to ask for help. It gets a little tougher with the remote environment, but we'll do some of these flying events just to have that time to bond, build rapport, even though it financially may not make sense, but it is important to build that camaraderie within the team. I think keeping those things top of mind as you make these decisions and what your employee experience is going to be like. I think those are probably the key things. Yeah, I mean, listening was the biggest one with the leadership. A lot of the calls I think I learned over time, and there's a lot of these things, right? You can listen to a lot of TED Talks and probably get this same advice, but just if you can listen, speak last, right? If you speak last, you'll find out more times than not. You don't have to say as much, that people actually know. I think that things that you get to talk over, if you can maybe take your proposition for somebody, but rephrase it as a question and make it like a how, what, or why type of question, then all of a sudden the dynamics are less of me talking down at you and more of me inviting you into the conversation as a peer. Or even sometimes I'll catch myself kind of pushing this idea across for somebody to do, but then I'll pause and ask a question, what do you think? Because again, I can invite them as a peer. And then if you do that, then you can get a stronger commitment. Because if somebody agrees with you, then they're more likely to give you a commitment to follow through. If they disagree with you, maybe they got some really good reason on why they should disagree with you, and you should probably listen to that. I think that's the most critical thing, is just if you can phrase those as questions. It goes back to that intent around listening. If you have disputes, right? If you have different views, there's no point in bantering and arguing your view to death, because you're not going to change your view. The other person's not. But if you can take the time to understand why the other person thinks the way they do, and truly, truly understand that, because every situation, even the most things that don't make sense, there is a reason the person thinks the way they do or did what they did for that rationale. Can you get to that point? You truly understand it. If you do, people, human nature, they'll tend to reciprocate. They'll all of a sudden the barriers break down, and they're more inclined to respond in the similar way and listen to you and try to understand your perspective. And then you're more inclined to figure out that compromise. You may find out in that journey that you were wrong about some of your positions and points, that you may change your own views and side with the other person, or you may have this more comprehensive understanding of the other person's thinking that you can then help guide them to your point of view, because now they're going to be more inclined to listen back to you, and you'll have more information, so you can incline them to your point of view. Or they may turn around and just actively want to learn from you and your perspective and start changing their views. But you'll get to a compromise, and that's why it's really important. That's like a strong fundamental thing when you're looking at leadership, but then you in turn want to build that as part of your culture, because part of that is minting other leaders and that similar type of approach, so that your organization across the board can grow stronger, that you're providing more than just a job, you're providing a platform for professional development and wealth generation.
What are indicators that my communication framework might not be on point? Like, how do I understand and uncover if I'm not yet at a point where we can openly and transparently communicate, and even when I think we do, and then maybe I realize, okay, I'm not at the point where I would love to be.
Sometimes you'll see it pretty obvious when you see things breaking because of communication, that things got missed, deadlines got missed. And when you look at the reasons why, 90% of these business problems are related to communication. You can figure that stuff out pretty quickly. I think depending on your team size, we're getting to that point where I have to lean on our HR resources to dig around and survey different people in the company to gather this kind of feedback. But we're continuously gathering feedback on employee experience. In the early days, I would make a point to have one-on-one calls, because there's feedback you can solicit in a group environment. But I realized, especially with working with engineers, they were more reserved to provide that level of feedback in a group setting. So I would have to have these one-on-one conversations, and that's where I got the true insights to understand those areas and gaps and deficiencies that we had.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it's just important to know that you have to constantly look for these indicators, and it's not something, or often nothing that just like jumps onto your desk and it's like, hey, you have a problem here. You have to really look for it and then be aware of it, and sometimes read between the lines as well.
100%. You have to be proactive. It's a continuous journey. There were always, even 10 plus years in doing this, we're continuously looking for opportunities to improve the employee experience.
What was the hardest part about developing yourself as a leader? Was it letting the ego in front of the door because you want to listen more instead of talking, and trying to show that you're that smart? Was it the even understanding what a good leader is? Like, what was the hard part about it?
We are blind to our weaknesses. I think our human nature is to hold ourselves in the utmost positive light, think of ourselves as good people. So we tend to shy away to think of ourselves and the flaws. So I think that's a big component, is to be very forward and about acknowledging, being conscious about those deficiencies that you have as an individual, because everybody does. There's always room to improve. Having that kind of mindset that maybe you're not quite there. There's a lot of room for you to develop and get better. And then you look at those areas of knowledge of the don't know what you don't know what you don't know what you know. So can you be proactive to uncover out of the don't know what you don't know into the know what you don't know, and then be able to make, so that's a part of it, because there are these deficiencies you have as a professional that you just don't know, you're completely blind to. And that's where it's nice to encourage that with your peers, your coworkers, to help identify that. And that's part of even when we interview people, we tell them very candidly up front. I get criticized for not giving much positive feedback, that I give a high volume of criticism, but I do have to periodically remind team members the reason I do that is because I look at these criticisms as an opportunity to improve. If I can help you improve as an individual, the team can improve, organization can improve to achieve our goals. But you do, because sometimes we have this nature to fuse our business and personal communication as one stream, but we need to send those reminders to proactively separate the two, and that this isn't nothing personal. I think that's because I want to receive that, and I have to welcome that in return. So to be able to solicit that same level of criticism as a leader, like I said, it's in large organization, it's a little tougher. I have HR help me, and they will give me my write-up and feedback that I can be impulsive on some of the decisions that can be too critical, just lack of patience and things of that sort. And it's good. It's good to have be conscious about it, kind of know what's really part of your personality, what are things that you could work and develop on. But I think that's the biggest challenge when the leadership development was being conscious about who you are and your ability and what you can and can't shape as a person.
How do you hold yourself accountable in these scenarios to grow as a person and to challenge yourself and define areas where you need to grow, and also take the time for learning instead of trying to dig too deep into the operational parts again?
So when you find one of those areas, I like to think of it as a learning pattern, right? Because a lot of times we don't step back and saying, how do we learn as an individual? Because we can get very default to constantly Googling things and reading these short form blog posts. But when I realized I had this bigger problem, some of the leadership challenges that the blog posts weren't giving me the right answers to, I said, hey, I better invest in reading books, right? And some people don't. If you don't read that, you got a pretty lacking channel right there. Now we push to read about 8-10 books a year. And it's just knowing when to invest in that, right? That's just looking objectively. That's part of a learning channel, that here's this area that I want to get more knowledge on. I'm going to invest in reading a book. The other area I think is often lacking, especially thinking of our education. They don't teach us this, but the channel of learning from subject matter experts, that you should proactively network with other industry peers, subject matter experts that have experience, that may have gone through it and have solved that problem or gone through a similar challenge. For me, a lot of the most value I've had is the peers of CEOs I've been able to connect with over the years, and be able to reach out and talk to them about some of these challenges and learn from their direct experience. So again, kind of looking at that whole overall pattern, are there areas in the way you learn that you actually need to develop that will accelerate your ability to learn and overcome those challenges? So that's one area. And then I think the reinforcement part, where to make these types of changes as an individual isn't an easy feat. You don't read a blog post and wake up with some chest thumping inspiration to make a dramatic change that quickly. So realizing that it's going to take some months to make that change, putting some commitment to it. Can you put a calendar daily reminder about that change you're working towards? I used to mumble bad, and that was something I had in my calendar, was to do a little exercise talking through the ABCs so I can better pronounce words completely and not sound like I'm mumbling so much. But that was something I had as a daily reminder. So, if you can find those areas and put it in. We want to work on meditation, great. It's not a one-time event. Put a reminder, do your meditation exercise, yoga practice, whatever it is that you're trying to build into a habit. I think scheduling it in there, having this reminder to hold yourself accountable to executing on it is an important thing to make that actual change.
Yeah, I think two words are very important here, or two characteristics: self-awareness, and then also the discipline to change something and follow this journey, because it's so easy to discover an area that you want to improve, but then also get like soaked up in everything else that you could do and need to focus on, or think you need to focus on, because it's just like it seems so precious that you have to do it right now and you cannot do and prioritize and here and there. So the discipline to prioritize and stick to the things that you commit to is super important, and often lacking for a lot of people, without like personally attacking them, more like I know it myself. There is so much that you could do and could work on right now that it's sometimes the easier route to focus on the things that feel like, okay, yeah, I have another task accomplished, instead of working on yourself and then taking the time to improve over time, because as you said, it might take months or even longer.
It's crazy. It only gets harder to prioritize yourself and stay aligned there.
I can imagine. Partly, I'm not yet at the point where it's like too crazy, but there is also, of course, a lot of things that I'm not doing. Another thing that I'm personally interested in, regarding your let's say flywheel that you built, how or at what point have you been at a point where you were like, okay, now or did you think about structuring the process in a way where you're like, okay, now I can use the community, the insights, everything we have to, let's say, launch a new software from time to time, because we uncover that this problem exists, we validate that people want to buy it, and we have the team and capacity to build a new product, because I think it's there, and everything you have definitely supports this flywheel. So you're now in a spot to have let's say, machinery and factory for products in a way, how I would call it. How much is too much? So when is the right time to build and commit to a new project, and when is, or how far did the previous project has to be that you say, okay, now we can take on a new challenge?
There's a big variable around your own resource management, because everybody has a different scenario depending on how much capital you have to deploy, how much patience you have, what are your goals, and the time frame you're trying to reach those goals. For us, I think some of the things we've done a little early, but I think in hindsight, it wasn't a bad thing. I think maybe the growth wasn't as fast as we anticipated, but over time, it allowed us to keep picking at it and working at it. Our firm room, we carved out a product. So I'll give you an example here. DealRoom is our flagship product. It's a full lifecycle management for M&A, end-to-end, the pipeline, the diligence, the integration. What I noticed on sitting on a couple sales calls was that there was these small boutique practices similar to what I ran that didn't need all that stuff. They're doing small deals, and they weren't interested in the workflow. They weren't interested in the price point. They wanted a low-cost solution, and they were mainly interested in the data security. They wanted a virtual data room. Now, we have the technology within our product. And the idea, the hypothesis is, what if we carve this out, but kept it as efficient as possible? Like they want a low-cost product. Let's give them a low-cost product. Let's take the same base code, strip down it to the simple functionality of a data room, and put it on its own instance, but allow it to operate on a self-service model, because our core product doesn't operate that way. It's an enterprise sales model. So we that was the hypothesis. Now I kind of asked around the engineers for the capability. They validated it, that this is something they could do. It really wouldn't be much resources to do it. And of course they want to build it right. I'm like, no, don't build it, because I know you guys like to build things and not fix things. So we tested it. We did a direct response campaign to 20,000 people saying, hey, here's a brand new product. We're introducing it with this introductory price, simple virtual data room product. We had 6 people respond that they were interested to purchase the product. That gave me enough validation to say, okay, we can go ahead and build this product. I think over time it validates that there's a market for it, and we can grow something from it. I remember the sales reps like, what do I do with the 6 people that want to buy a product that doesn't exist? Like, we'll tell them we get a free upgrade to our deal room solution here. But and over time we built that product, and it really didn't do much the first couple of years at all. It wasn't a lost lead for us because we spent minimal to get that thing out the door. But then over time, we've noticed in years 3 and 4, there was pretty substantial growth all through word of mouth. We weren't even expenditures on advertising or anything. And now it turned out to be one of our most profitable, highest ROI solution we've ever made. And it's something that's really positioned our company well. But so sometimes you end up with these type of things where it can come a little bit longer than you expect. But that's where I think that the capital management is a big part to get a sense of when that makes sense to take those bets, and knowing, because for us, it wasn't a big distraction. We fed the support through our main support. So it was only chat support. It was no sales reps that were managing the product. The support was really minimal because it was a very simple product. So it's ended up working out that way. That's not the clearest answer to your question about when do you start looking at these other lines. I do think it's a real big thing to ask about the business you're growing, because there's other areas where you may want to focus on your core product and really make sure. If I look at where some of the areas I thought we went too early on, the distribution is the hardest part in building a business. And I still think that some areas we got ahead of ourselves where it did distract from us building the distribution model and maturing it faster than building the new products for the ecosystem. So I think being conscious about that, what's that maturity curve look like for your distribution? Because we did really well on the marketing side, but then the maturity on the sales side didn't move as fast. And even the product side, we started building out new products and new lines, but we're further behind, and that's that distribution model is what ultimately drives all this growth and gets those revenues faster. So just being conscious about those different functions in your organizations and making sure that your strategy aligns to the maturity of those functions will help you have better assurance in how well you can execute on those strategies.
And when you're launching a new product, how do you validate and evaluate pricing? Because I think a lot of software startups are missing out on pricing because they're just going too low, and because they're looking for the product-led growth solutions are like, okay, $10 a month, $20 a month, and some are just too high a price or too high priced, where then they don't generate sales. How do you find the sweet spot for such a model?
Yeah, DealRoom is a prime example. We started DealRoom with a $100 a month price tag, and now we're a $50,000 to $100,000 a year subscription. So we went from one extreme to the other extreme. It's a harder one, and that's where it goes back to validating that go-to-market. When you're doing those solution interviews, can you gather feedback as early as possible? It's not like a big quantitative analysis on it. It is tricky. Even when you look at these big box, a CPG type of products out there, they're doing some interesting research to figure that out, but ultimately they'll still get very qualitative and actually talk to people and understand their perception around pricing. That, hey, if you price it too low, you're looked upon as the cheap product in the market. And then if you price higher, and we've always had it, like, you want to have this nature to be competitively priced, but it's not always a good thing. And even our market, like, we're confident that we're the premium product, so we price to be the premium product. And we back it up by providing premium service with it, which we've now captured feedback and reviews to back that up and validate it. And now we stay positioned on that. And with our other products, we do that as well. And we've seen it where when we launched our initial academy program, we started at a very low price point. And when we got to a point where we increased it, we actually increased not only the volume of sales, but the overall revenue on each ticket. So that's pricing is one that's definitely, I think, requires that same level of capturing feedback and iterating on, but also just experimenting if you can get the stuff on the website, see how people interact with it. But it is an ongoing one. We do pricing adjustments twice a year. We do a major pricing adjustment at the end of the year, a full overhaul. I think this year I did about 25 interviews with industry practitioners to gather feedback on our go-to-market or strategy and specific pricing points. And then mid-year, we'll do an update. We sort of take feedback from sales reps and other areas, and we'll do some minor adjustments. We try not to do a big overhaul mid-year. I can't say we haven't done that before, but we try not to. And then usually at the end of the year, we'll do more of the bigger things that we've been thinking about, pricing strategies.
I think pricing is one of the most underrated adjustment points that software startups out there are missing out on. So very important topic, and I will definitely cover it more often in the podcast, and maybe at some point we will do a dedicated episode for pricing, because I think that's an interesting one. But if we would start with that, we would sit here for definitely a long time. So maybe I'm allowed to invite you for that again. But it's an absolute pleasure to have all these insights and all your thoughts on all these topics. A few or one or two last questions that I have to round up the interview, because I think we covered a lot. And we talked about a lot of different areas. First question that I have is, what's one thing that you would love to tell a lot of founders, because they what they need to prioritize earlier, what you learned the hard way? We talked about a few things, but maybe there's like one key message that you also want to let a lot of founders know as let's say somehow some last words in a podcast.
Yeah, we talked a lot about the listening to create that feedback loop. We talked about empathy to really build your leadership and understand the environment and people and how to solve for the problems. I think that there's always this up and down in the business. I mean, we've gone through multiple brinks of failure where, knock on wood, where I never imagined this business getting this far. We've had some true financial struggles where I was at ends to figure out what we're gonna do to solve it. I think even just taking the bets, I do see a lot of organizations that just get complacent in where they're at and their growth becomes stagnant. I think this just mindset to be in control of your state of motivation, that you are going to have to weather a lot of these ups and downs, but can you control that as an individual? I think that's, I don't know if it's a skill of its own, but it's one of the biggest challenges is you're controlling your own emotions around this, that it's not going to be easy. There's just some distraught and that feeling of failure and sick to your stomach that you're going to have to overcome. But how do you control that and turn it into this burning desire to overcome it and win? And just be able to have that ability to do that, to be able to overcome the most disastrous looking scenarios you could be in, dealing with customers, having big failure issues. We've had some big security problems and large transactions that we're managing and very upset customers. We've had financial crisis, scrambling to get money to keep the company going. But to be able to weather through that and have this mindset that you can stay optimistic, stay focused on what your end goals are. The number one reason you fail is because you give up, but to be able to persist in that way, to be resilient and overcome that. And it's easy to say, but how do you build your ability to do that? It's like this ability to get out of body, right? Because I feel like you have this natural response to those scenarios and the environment you're in. It is very natural, but can you train yourself almost like this muscle that you have internally that you can flex to be able to displace yourself and be able to act in a natural way in those scenarios. And that a natural way can allow you to be calm when you're should be stressed or in concern, to be confident in the situations of dire distress. That ability to get out of body, I think that's the thing that separates the entrepreneurs from the ones that really weather through and achieve that upper echelon of success versus the ones that don't.
I can definitely not ask another question after this. I think that's a lot to think about for everybody, what it means for themselves. And I think that's a perfect roundup for a great interview. Kison, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I will definitely link to your LinkedIn, to M&A Science, to the books we talked about, to especially to your podcast as well, so that people who want to learn more about M&A can also listen there and jump into the universe of M&A. Thank you so much for taking the time. I wish you all the best for the future, and I hope to speak to you soon again on the show.
Hey, my pleasure, Fabian. I enjoyed the conversation.